We already know how to give ourselves a visual representation of categorical syllogisms using Venn diagrams. But now what we want to do is we want to use Venn diagrams and apply them to categorical syllogisms so we can decide when an argument, a categorical syllogism, is valid or invalid. So part of what we need to do is talking about categorical syllogisms in standard form. And we're going to talk about two properties of categorical syllogisms as well, its mood and its figure. So first, let's address our attention to categorical syllogisms in standard form. They have to meet 4 conditions to be in standard form. So first, each proposition is a standard form categorical proposition. So each of the 3 propositions that make up a categorical syllogism needs itself to be in standard form. And that's something we've already discussed. 2, each of the syllogism's terms occurs twice, and the 2 occurrences are identical. So we'll have 3 different terms in a categorical syllogism, and each of those 3 terms needs to occur twice. Each of the terms is used in the same sense throughout the argument. So basically, it's not in standard form if it equivocates. And 4, when we give the categorical syllogism, our first premise is going to be what's called the major premise. The second premise is what we call the minor premise. And then we'll have our conclusion. And when we get to diagramming, our left circle will correspond to the subject term of the conclusion. The predicate term of the conclusion will be the right circle. And then the middle circle is going to correspond to what we call the middle term. The major premise is going to contain this term, the predicate term of the conclusion. The minor premise is going to contain the subject term of the conclusion, and they both are going to contain the middle term. That's the common ground that the premises have to work with one another to get us to the conclusion. So let me reiterate that. We have 3 terms of a standard form categorical syllogism. One of our terms is going to correspond to the predicate term of the conclusion, and that's what we call our major term. And it needs to be present for our categorical syllogism to be in standard form. It needs to be present in premise 1. That is our major premise. The subject term of the conclusion is what we call the minor term. And it also needs to show up in our second premise, what we call the minor premise. And then we can identify the middle term because it's the term that occurs in both the major and the minor premise. So in both of our premises. So now we can talk about the structure of categorical syllogisms in standard form. So each of our premises and our conclusion will be in standard form for categorical propositions. So we'll have quantifier, subject class term, copula, and then predicate class term. We've already been discussing how our first premise is going to be our major premise and therefore needs to contain the major term, but it also needs to contain the middle term. But it doesn't matter what order they occur. That is, it doesn't matter which is the subject term and which is the predicate term. It just needs to be that both of those terms occur in the major premise. And we get the same sort of thing for our minor premise. It needs to contain the minor term. It needs to contain the middle term. But as it doesn't matter which one is the subject class or the predicate class. It doesn't matter which one is the subject term or which one is the predicate term. The order is going to matter, though, in the conclusion. So the subject class is always going to be the minor term, and the predicate class is always going to be the major term. So let's look at the following argument and think about how we would put it in standard form. So let's make it a standard form categorical syllogism. So it says all snowflakes are six-pointed crystals. Therefore, some six-pointed crystals are not uniform solids, since some snowflakes are not uniform solids. The first thing to note for us is that proposition 2, or sentence 2, of the categorical syllogism is our conclusion. So we're going to put that as some six-pointed crystals are not uniform solids. So we can determine then the minor term by identifying the subject class of our conclusion. So our minor term is going to be six-pointed crystals. And so it needs to be what figures in premise 2. Well, sentence 1 of the argument is what contains six-pointed crystals. So that tells us all snowflakes are six-pointed circles goes into premise 2, our minor premise. Then we can identify the major premise looking at the predicate term of our conclusion, which is uniform solids. And when we examine the argument, we see that it is sentence 3 that contains uniform solids, and that's got to be our major premise as a result. So some snowflakes are not uniform solids. And now we have our argument up here, up at the top. Now we have it in standard form. Now let's look at what we call the mood of the categorical syllogism. So in order to determine the mood of the categorical syllogism, we look at the type of propositions that occur in the order of the major premise, the minor premise, and then the conclusion. So we just go with the order of putting the kind of categorical syllogism A, E, I, or O from left to right, the first premise, the second premise, and then the conclusion. By first premise, second premise, we mean the major premise, the minor premise, and then the conclusion. So if we go back to the previous argument that we've been looking at, what we'll see is our first premise, some snowflakes are not uniform solids, is an O statement. Our second premise, the minor premise, is all snowflakes are six-pointed crystals, so it's an A statement. And our conclusion says that some six-pointed crystals are not uniform solids, so it's an O statement. And that's just what we put in the order of major premise, minor premise, conclusion, O, A, O. And then when considering the figure, what we do is we see how the middle terms are situated in the major premise and minor premise. And that'll give us the figure 1, 2, 3, or 4. So a handy little way of remembering what pattern corresponds to what figure is to use this little diagram. So if you remember this diagram, then you can think of our middle terms when they are in this pattern here, this diagonal pattern that trends downward, and that corresponds with figure 1. Whereas if our middle terms are both in the predicate placement of both our major and minor terms, then that's going to correspond with figure 2. The idea of this notion of magnets in between 2 and 3 is to let us know that there shouldn't be any space in between here. So our non-middle terms can't be placed there. So it lets us know that the non-middle terms are in the subject placement in 2, and our non-middle terms are in the predicate placement in 3, whereas the middle terms are in our subject placement in 3. And our last option is to have a diagonal that trends upwards from left to right. And that corresponds with figure 4. So then left to right, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we have a very helpful way for figuring out what our figure is. So again, we go back to this argument we have been looking at. And first we identify what our middle terms are. Well, it's going to be snowflakes, because that's the term that occurs twice in our major and minor premises. And we notice that they're both in the subject placement. So we draw our diagram. And the one corresponding with middle terms in both the subject placement is not 1, not 2, but 3, and not 4. So the figure is 3. So the mood and figure of the standard form categorical syllogism that we've been looking at is OAO3. All right, we're now going to turn to a practice example in which we're going to put a categorical syllogism into standard form, and then we're going to determine its mood and its figure. So we have the following argument. some analgesics are not ibuprofens, since all aspirin-based pain relievers are analgesics, and no aspirin-based pain relievers are ibuprofens. So take a little bit of time, pause the video, and put this categorical syllogism into standard form and determine its mood and figure. All right, the first thing we want to do in this argument is figure out what our conclusion is. So it says some analgesics are not ibuprofens. Why? Because all aspirin-based pain relievers are analgesics and no aspirin-based pain relievers are ibuprofens. So the way that this is structured, our last two clauses are being offered in support of our first clause. So one is going to be our conclusion. Some analgesics are not ibuprofens. So that tells us that analgesics is our major or minor term rather, and our major term is ibuprofens. Well, I see in sentence 3 or clause 3 that it contains ibuprofens. So that tells me that's going to be our major term, or major premise rather. So no aspirin-based pain relievers are ibuprofens. And of course that means 2 must be our minor premise. All aspirin-based pain relievers are analgesics. And we double check and see that indeed this needs to be the major premise, since it corresponds or contains the major term. And this is indeed the minor premise, since it contains the minor term. So now let's look at the mood and the figure. I like to draw a little diagram. Helps me determine what the mood and figure, well, helps me determine what the figure is anyway. Since the middle terms are both in the subject term, it's going to have to be 3 again. So I know the figure is 3. All right, coming back to the categorical syllogism and the mood, we said that the major premise is no aspirin-based pain relievers are ibuprofens. We said that our minor premise is all aspirin-based pain relievers are analgesics. And we said that our conclusion is some analgesics are not ibuprofens. So we have for our major premise an E proposition, our minor premise an A proposition, and our conclusion we have an O proposition. So E, A, O. So our mood is E, A, O, and the figure is 3. We can also move in the other direction, where we first are given the mood and the figure of a categorical syllogism, and we can show what it would look like in its standard form. So if we're given the mood A, E, O in the figure 3, and we let S stand for the minor term, P stand for the major term, and M stand for the middle term, we can show what that categorical syllogism looks like in its standard form. So go ahead and try reconstructing or constructing that categorical syllogism given that information, and then I'll give you the correct answer. I first suggest determining where your middle terms are going to be placed. And we use this diagram to determine that. So I know that both of my middle terms are going to find themselves in our subject terms of our premises, of our major premise and our minor premise. So since M stands for our middle term, we know that we can put an M where our subject term goes. Now we know our first premise is going to be our major premise, and we're told that it is an A proposition, so all M are, we find the major term, that's P, and we've got the first premise completed. Moving to the second premise, which is the minor premise, we're told that it's an E proposition, so no M or S, since it needs to include the minor term. And then the conclusion is an O proposition, and the minor term is always going to go into the subject placement. So some S are not, and then the major term is always going to go in the predicate placement of the conclusion. So some S are not P.